The morning of Tuesday, 14th June 2015, dawned like any other on Elm Street. Birds sang their cheerful tunes, the scent of freshly cut grass hung in the air. Milk floats hummed their quiet way down the lane. Yet by nightfall, a chilling silence would descend. The Peterson family, Arthur, his wife Eleanor, and their two young children, 10-year-old Thomas and 8-year-old Emily, had vanished. They simply disappeared. No note was left behind. No calls were made to concerned relatives. Their car, a sensible blue saloon, still sat innocently in the driveway. It was as if they had been plucked from the earth, leaving everything behind. Neighbors first noticed something amiss when the Petersons' usually boisterous dog, Buster, didn't bark his morning greetings. Mrs. Gable, from next door, remembered seeing Arthur mowing the lawn the previous afternoon. He had waved, a broad smile on his kind face. Eleanor had been tending her prize-winning roses, her laughter carrying on the gentle breeze. The children, Thomas and Emily, were playing hopscotch on the pavement, their happy shouts a familiar soundtrack to the quiet street. Now, there was only an unnerving stillness. The curtains in the Peterson house remained drawn throughout the day, an unusual occurrence. As dusk began to settle, casting long, eerie shadows across the neat gardens, a sense of unease rippled through the close-knit community. Mr. Henderson, who lived opposite, decided to investigate. He knocked on the Petersons' front door. The sound echoed strangely, met only by silence. He peered through the letterbox. The hallway was dark. A child's toy lay abandoned near the stairs. A newspaper, still folded, rested on the doormat. A cold dread began to creep into his heart. This was not right. This was terribly, inexplicably wrong. Concern quickly turned to alarm. Calls were made, first to other friends, then to distant relatives. No one had heard from the Petersons. No one had any idea where they could be. The police were contacted late that evening. Officers arrived, their serious expressions mirroring the growing fear on the faces of the gathered neighbors. They forced entry into the silent house. Inside, everything appeared normal, yet hauntingly so. Dinner plates were laid out on the kitchen table, as if awaiting a meal that would never be eaten. School bags were packed, ready for the next day. The Petersons were gone. The initial search was frantic. Police officers combed through every inch of the Peterson home. They looked for signs of a struggle, for any clue that might explain the family's sudden departure. Dust motes danced in the torch beams, illuminating a life interrupted. Upstairs, beds were neatly made, clothes hung tidily in wardrobes. In the children's rooms, toys were scattered as if momentarily put aside. There was nothing to suggest a planned exit, no packed suitcases, no farewell notes scribbled in haste. It was a home frozen in time, waiting for its occupants to return. Friends and neighbors joined the search parties. They fanned out across the local woods, their voices calling the family's names. They checked nearby parks and deserted buildings. Each fruitless hour deepened their despair. How could 4 people simply vanish into thin air? The question hung heavy, unspoken, but felt by all. Mrs. Gable clutched a photograph of Emily, her bright, smiling face a painful reminder of the vibrant life that had been extinguished from Elm Street. She remembered Emily's infectious giggle, a sound she feared she would never hear again. The silence from this Peterson house was a constant, gnawing presence. The media descended upon Elm Street, their vans and cameras turning the quiet cul-de-sac into a circus. Reporters interviewed anyone who had known the Petersons, seeking soundbites for the evening news. Theories abounded. Had they run away from debt? Had they been targeted by criminals? Or was it something far more sinister? Speculation ran wild, each new idea more terrifying than the last. The police urged caution, but the fear was palpable. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every unfamiliar car driving down the street was viewed with suspicion by the anxious residents. Days turned into weeks. The intense search gradually wound down. The police admitted they had no viable leads. The Peterson house remained empty, a shrine to a lost family. Yellow police tape still crisscrossed the front door, a stark warning. Flowers left by well-wishers wilted on the doorstep. The children's laughter no longer echoed down the street. Instead, a heavy quietude settled over Elm Street, a constant reminder of the family who had been there one moment and gone the next. The hope that had initially burned so brightly began to flicker and fade, replaced by a grim acceptance. As weeks bled into months, the disappearance of the Peterson family became a local legend, a chilling tale whispered among residents. The police investigation, despite its initial vigor, had hit a brick wall. Detectives meticulously re-examined every piece of information, every statement, every tiny detail from the Peterson home. They delved into Arthur's work as an accountant and Eleanor's involvement with local charities. They looked for any hint of trouble, any secret life, any reason someone might want them to disappear. But the Petersons appeared to be an ordinary, happy family, with no known enemies or insurmountable problems. Their vanishing act was utterly baffling. The community struggled to come to terms with the void left behind. School friends of Thomas and Emily drew pictures for their missing classmates, pictures that would never be delivered. Teachers spoke of two bright, engaging children full of promise. At the local community centre, Eleanor's absence was keenly felt. Her volunteering efforts had touched many lives. Arthur's colleagues remembered him as a dependable, if somewhat quiet, man. The questions were relentless. Why then? What could possibly have happened? The lack of answers was a torment, allowing the darkest imaginings to take root in people's minds. Life on Elm Street tried to return to a semblance of normality, but it was forever changed. Neighbours looked at each other differently, a shared trauma binding them, yet also creating an undercurrent of suspicion. Had someone seen something? Had someone known something they weren't telling? The trust that had once defined their small community felt fractured. Every so often, a fresh wave of media interest would briefly reignite the case, perhaps a new unfounded theory or an anniversary piece, but each time it only served to reopen old wounds without offering any solace or resolution for those left behind. The Peterson house itself became a source of morbid curiosity and quiet dread. It stood silent and dark, its garden slowly succumbing to weeds. Some said it was haunted, that the spirits of the missing family roamed its empty rooms. Children on their way to school would hurry past, daring each other to touch the gate, but never quite managing it. The local council eventually boarded up the windows and doors to prevent vandalism, but this only added to its desolate, forbidding appearance. It was a constant physical reminder of the mystery that refused to be solved, a scar on the face of Elm Street. 5 years crawled by, then 10. The vibrant colours of the Peterson family photographs, occasionally republished in local papers on anniversaries of their disappearance, began to fade in people's memories. New families moved into Elm Street, families who only knew the story as a piece of local folklore. A tragic tale from the past. For those who had known the Petersons, however, the passage of time did little to dull the ache of their absence. Mrs. Gable still kept a small framed picture of Emily and Thomas on her mantelpiece. Sometimes she would swear she could still hear their laughter on the wind. The police file on the Peterson family remained open, but it gathered dust in a cold case archive. Leads had long since dried up. Detectives who had worked on the initial investigation had retired or moved on. To the authorities, it was one of many unsolved mysteries, a statistical anomaly. But for the friends and remaining family of the Petersons, it was a wound that never truly healed. Hope, once a flickering candle, had all but extinguished, replaced by a dull, persistent grief and the heavy burden of not knowing. The not knowing was the worst part, a constant gnawing uncertainty that offered no peace. The Peterson house, now legally in the hands of a distant cousin who had no wish to live there and found it impossible to sell, stood as a monument to the tragedy. Its paint peeled. Its garden was a wilderness. Local teenagers sometimes dared each other to break in, but few ever got further than the overgrown front path. Spooked by the oppressive atmosphere that clung to the property, it was as if the house itself held its breath, guarding its secrets jealously. The story of the vanishing family had become woven into the fabric of the town's history, a cautionary tale for generations to come. Occasionally, a new resident unaware of the full history might inquire about the derelict house. They would be met with solemn expressions and hushed tones as the story was recounted. The tale always ended the same way. They simply vanished. No trace, no explanation. The mystery endured, a dark undercurrent beneath the surface of everyday life in the small town. The weight of those missing years pressed down on everyone who remembered the bright smiles and happy voices of Arthur, Eleanor, Thomas, and Emily Peterson. They were ghosts in the town's collective memory, forever young, forever lost. 15 years after the Petersons disappeared, in the spring of 2030, the house on Elm Street was finally sold. The distant cousin, tired of the property taxes and the constant reminder of the family tragedy, had put it on the market at a rock-bottom price. It was bought by a young couple, Liam and Sarah, who were new to the area. They were looking for a renovation project, a house they could make their own. They knew of the property's grim history, of course. The estate agent had been obliged to tell them, but they were practical people, not easily swayed by local legends or ghost stories. Liam, a builder by trade, saw potential in the dilapidated structure. Sarah, an interior designer, envisioned transforming the dark, neglected rooms into bright, welcoming spaces. They were aware of the whispers, the curious glances from some of the older neighbors, but they were determined to breathe new life into the forgotten house. They planned to start with the basics, securing the structure, clearing the overgrown garden, and then gutting the interior. The house had good bones, Liam would say, a solid foundation despite years of neglect. They were young, optimistic, and ready for the challenge ahead. The initial clearing of the garden was a monumental task. Weeds had grown into small trees. The once neat lawn was a tangled mess. As Liam worked, he sometimes felt a strange chill, even on warm days. He dismissed it as his imagination, fueled by the stories he'd heard. Sarah, drawing up plans for the interior, found herself increasingly drawn to the old house's atmosphere. It wasn't menacing, she thought, more like a deep sadness, a lingering echo of what had been lost. She often found herself wondering about the family who had lived there, about the children who had played in these rooms. One afternoon, while inspecting the foundations in the cellar, Liam noticed something odd. Behind a crumbling section of old plasterboard, tacked clumsily onto one of the stone walls, he thought he saw a faint line too straight to be a natural crack in the stone. It was almost hidden by shadows and debris. Curiosity piqued, he fetched a pry bar and a torch. He gently tapped the plasterboard. It sounded hollow behind that particular section. His heart began to beat a little faster. This wasn't on any of the original house plans he'd managed to obtain. What could be hidden there? Liam carefully inserted the pry bar into the faint crack he had discovered in the cellar wall. The old plasterboard groaned in protest as he applied pressure. Dust, thick and acrid, billowed around him, catching in the beam of his torch. He coughed, waving a hand in front of his face. Sarah called down from the kitchen, asking if everything was all right. Liam shouted back that it was just some stubborn plasterboard, but he thought he had found something, though his voice was tight with a mixture of excitement and a strange, unidentifiable apprehension. He pulled harder, and a section of the board came away with a tearing sound. Behind it was not solid stone, as he had expected. Instead, there was a dark opening, framing what looked like a heavy steel door. It was rusted around the edges, but unmistakably a door, complete with a large, industrial-looking wheel handle, the kind one might see on a bank vault or a submarine hatch. Goosebumps prickled Liam's arms. This was no ordinary cellar feature. This was deliberately concealed. He shone his torch on the door. There were no visible hinges on this side, and the wheel looked like it hadn't been turned in a very, very long time. Who would install such a thing in a suburban house, and why hide it? He called Sarah down to the cellar. Her eyes widened when she saw the hidden door, and she whispered, asking what on earth it was, her voice hushed with awe and a touch of fear. Liam replied that he had no idea, his mind racing, and said it looked like some sort of panic room or a vault. He reached out and touched the cold metal of the wheel. It was stiff, caked with rust and grime. He tried to turn it, grunting with the effort, but it wouldn't budge. He said it was seized solid, frustration creeping into his tone, and mentioned they would need some tools to get it open, maybe some penetrating oil. As they stood there, staring at the imposing steel barrier, a faint sound reached their ears. It was almost imperceptible at first, easily mistaken for the settling of the old house or the wind outside. But then they heard it again, a scratching, a weak rhythmic tapping. It seemed to be coming from the other side of the door. Liam and Sarah looked at each other, their faces paling. Sarah breathed, asking if Liam heard that, her hand flying to her mouth. Liam nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the door. The sound came again, a desperate, feeble noise. Someone or something was on the other side. Panic surged through Liam. The tapping sound, however faint, was undeniably real. It was the sound of life, trapped and desperate. He yelled, asking if anyone was in there and if they could hear him. His voice echoed in the small cellar, followed by an almost unbearable silence. Then a muffled groan, so weak it was barely audible, filtered through the thick steel. Sarah gripped Liam's arm, her knuckles white, exclaiming in shock that there was someone in there and that they had to get them out. The thought of who or what had been imprisoned behind that door for potentially years was terrifying, yet the immediate human need to help overrode everything else. Liam raced upstairs, grabbing his heaviest tools, a sledgehammer, a crowbar, and a can of industrial-grade lubricant. Adrenaline coursed through his veins. He sprayed the lubricant around the wheel mechanism and any visible seams of the door, then began to hammer at the wheel with controlled, powerful blows, trying to break the rusted seal. Each clang of the hammer reverberated through the cellar. Sarah stood by, her face etched with anxiety, calling out words of encouragement to whoever was on the other side, telling them to hold on and that they were trying to get to them, promising they would get them out. After what felt like an eternity of frantic effort, the wheel finally gave a hideous screech and turned just a fraction. Liam strained, his muscles burning, and slowly, agonizingly, the heavy door began to creak inwards. A blast of stale, fetid air rushed out, making them both recoil and gag. It was the smell of confinement, of despair, of life lived in darkness. As the gap widened, Liam shone his powerful torch into the pitch-black space beyond. What he saw made his blood run cold. Two pairs of eyes, wide and reflecting the light like frightened animals, stared back at him from the oppressive gloom. Slowly, hesitantly, two figures emerged from the darkness, blinking against the sudden light. They were emaciated, their clothes hanging like rags on their skeletal frames. Their skin was deathly pale, their hair long and matted. One was a man, his face gaunt, his eyes hollow. The other, a woman, looked frail enough to shatter. Behind them, huddled further back in the shadows, were two smaller figures, the Peterson family. They were alive, changed, almost unrecognizable, but undeniably alive after 15 long, silent years. The shock was a physical blow, leaving Liam and Sarah utterly speechless. The scene that unfolded was one of disbelief and profound shock. The man, Arthur Peterson, stumbled forward, his voice a ragged whisper, asking if the light was real. Eleanor clung to him, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. Thomas and Emily, now young adults in their mid-20s, looked bewildered and terrified, shielding their eyes from the unaccustomed brightness. They had grown up in the darkness. The police and emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics carefully attended to the family, their condition fragile. How had they survived for so long, locked away from the world in this hidden tomb? The truth, when it slowly pieced together, was a horrifying tale of misadventure and grim determination. Arthur, a man with a deep-seated fear of societal collapse, had secretly built the reinforced room as an elaborate panic room. It was stocked with tinned goods, bottled water, and survival supplies, intended to last for months, perhaps a year. During a fierce, unexpected summer storm 15 years prior, a lightning strike had caused a small fire in the main house. Panicked, Arthur had ushered his family into the shelter. The heavy steel door, designed to seal hermetically, had slammed shut with a faulty locking mechanism he'd been meaning to fix. They were trapped. Their initial supplies, though substantial, were finite. Arthur, a meticulous planner in his paranoia, had rationed everything stringently from day one. They had a chemical toilet and a hand-cranked air filtration system. Water was their biggest concern, but a slow, almost imperceptible drip from a condensation pipe, which Arthur managed to collect, had supplemented their bottled stores just enough. They lived in near-total darkness to conserve battery power for a single small lamp, using it only for brief periods each day. They told stories, Eleanor homeschooled the children from memory, and they clung to the hope of rescue, a hope that dwindled with each passing year. The psychological toll was immense. Days blurred into nights. The world outside became a distant memory for Arthur and Eleanor, and an abstract concept for Thomas and Emily, who had only vague recollections of sunshine and open spaces. They had created their own small, dark world, governed by routine and the desperate will to live. They had no way of signaling for help, the room being too deep and soundproof. Their survival was a testament to human resilience, but also a stark picture of unimaginable suffering. The discovery was not just a rescue, it was the unearthing of a lost world, a family frozen in time, now thrust back into a reality they no longer knew. The news of the Peterson family's discovery sent shockwaves not just through Elm Street, but across the nation and beyond. It was a story almost too incredible to believe. Neighbors who had long mourned them wept tears of astonished joy, mixed with a profound sense of sorrow for the years stolen from their lives. Mrs. Gable, frail now but her memory sharp, held Eleanor's hand in the hospital, a silent communion of shared grief and miraculous reunion. For Thomas and Emily, the world outside their hidden room was an overwhelming barrage of new sensations, colors, sounds, and faces. They had to learn about a world that had moved on without them for a decade and a half. The family faced a long and arduous journey of recovery, both physically and psychologically. Years of malnutrition and lack of sunlight had taken their toll. The darkness had left its mark on their minds as much as their bodies. Therapists and specialists were brought in to help them readjust. Arthur was consumed by guilt over the faulty door and his paranoia that had led to their entombment, though his family remarkably showed him only love and understanding for his efforts to keep them alive within their prison. The world marveled at their survival, but also grappled with the profound tragedy of their lost years. Liam and Sarah, the young couple who had bought the house, found their lives irrevocably changed. They were hailed as heroes, but they felt more like accidental witnesses to a miracle and a tragedy intertwined. They decided to sell the house, unable to shake the profound sadness that now clung to its walls despite the joyous outcome of their discovery. The Peterson house, once a symbol of mystery and loss, now stood as a testament to endurance. It was eventually bought by a local historical society who debated how best to commemorate the extraordinary events that had transpired within its walls. The community of Elm Street, once fractured by suspicion and unanswered questions, found a new sense of unity in supporting the Peterson family's slow reintegration into society. Benefits were organized. People offered help in countless small ways. The story served as a stark reminder of the fragility of life, but also of the incredible strength of the human spirit. The shocking truth was not one of malice or foul play, but of a terrible accident and the incredible will to survive against unimaginable odds. The Peterson family had returned from the shadows, and though forever scarred, they faced the new dawn together, a symbol of hope in a world that had almost forgotten them.